Thanks very much, Sam. I'm assuming that you all can hear me, and thank you very much to everybody for joining us for this overview. What I'm going to do right now is frame how at Search Institute we landed and why on a focus on perseverance from among the constellation of what often get called non-cognitive skill done. And then I'm going to turn it over to Peter to give a sense of the opportunities and challenges that we've been working through as we have developed a new survey that we are calling the Perseverance Survey. I want to flag the fact at the outset that we are looking for organizations that serve young people, whether it's schools or out-of-school time programs, to participate either this summer or probably more likely next fall in the pilot phase of that survey. And so if you get interested in the ideas we run through here and are interested in working with us to look at data on the constructs that we'll be talking about today, there will be some email addresses and ways to let us know that you're interested in helping us extend and deepen this work. So, in order to get started, I wanted to very briefly root this work in Search Institute's previous work. For those of you who know our organization, this is actually the 25th anniversary of the creation of what we've called the developmental assets. 40 correlates with healthy youth outcomes and educational success that fall into two broad categories: external assets, supports outside kids that help them grow and develop successfully, and internal assets or strengths, and you can see that there. I wanted to flag this because to some extent the emphasis on non-cognitive skills, and in particular on grit, or the related construct that we'll be talking about today of perseverance, are now hot topics. And we think that they're productively hot topics because they matter a lot to kids' success both inside and outside school. But as Peter will be describing in a moment, it's important to know that we're not new to the discussion. I'm actually still fairly new to Search Institute, but our organization, and Peter in particular, have been working on what we've called internal assets for quite a long time. And under the category of internal assets, in particular that commitment to learning, but also the other categories, positive values, social competencies, and positive identity, have deeply informed the work we're going to describe for you today on perseverance. Probably a lot of you are participating in this webinar because you have gotten interested in what is a growing national discussion, and many of you may have read Paul Tuff's book, How Children Succeed: Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character. If you haven't, it's a good read and something that you might consider adding to your summer reading list. I think that it's tapping a vein of dialogue and interest that is pretty directly related to, at least within schools, where we've been as a nation under No Child Left Behind, where we were attempting to reduce educational success to a very defined body of content that can be measured on a standardized test. But as we've actually gone and looked more deeply at what really matters for success beyond school, we've seen that mastery of academic content is necessary but not sufficient. Here's just one quick piece of evidence that bolsters that idea. You can see when ACT, the organization that administers the pre-college entrance assessments, did some empirical work and looked at how students do in college as measured by their GPA, and then went back and looked at the way that those young people performed in high school. You can see that high school grades actually was what mattered the most, which, as all of us who've been teachers or been students know, includes a lot of non-cognitive skill. But very importantly, academic behaviors came out with 17%, and those learning behaviors are a big aspect of what we're going to be talking about today. It's not the top category, but it matters in very significant ways to success in higher education. I'll say that actually ACT did a similar study about what matters in high school using middle school data, and once again they found that academic behaviors matter a lot for young people's success educationally. But one other further piece of evidence, and probably most of you who come to this webinar today of your own free will don't need this because we're probably preaching to the choir, but one more data point from a large national survey of employers that was put together a while back, and you can see that when they asked what matters for people in your organization who you employ, whether they're college grads or whether they have a high school diploma as their top credential, things like oral communications, teamwork, professionalism, and work ethic are really important and noticeably higher than English, math, and science, which is, of course, not to say those things don't matter, but really, really critical pieces of the puzzle. There's been a growing interest in these skills, in part because there have been a series of really novel and interesting experiments, mostly in psychology, but also in behavioral economics and other fields, that have really framed the importance of these skills through novel, as I said, experiments that sometimes pretty dramatically illustrate their importance. The most famous one that has been replicated in different ways many times, and about which actually there are some very differing opinions among researchers, is the marshmallow experiment that showed that young people who were able to defer eating a marshmallow and left alone in a room actually had better educational and other outcomes many years later, but young people who ate the marshmallow immediately did less well over time. The big question, though, that the marshmallow experiment and the many other psychological experiments that are getting attention in the worlds of research and practice today raises is, can you change that? Is it what we call a malleable factor? And if a young person doesn't wait to eat the marshmallow, are there ways that actually we can help him or her learn to defer gratification and ultimately achieve better outcomes over time? So there's a big reason to pay attention to these skills in terms of post-secondary readiness. There's big reasons to pay attention to these skills in terms of workforce readiness. But finally, I thought I would just note that I think the subjects we're going to be talking about here today also really tie to civic readiness. They really are pretty deep in the American psyche and culture. And that's a picture of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in D.C. that was taken as Hurricane Sandy bore down upon that city. And I actually happened to have been there that day and got the last plane out. And so whenever I look at that picture of the soldiers at the Tomb of the Unknowns, it encapsulates for me a certain vision of resilience and grit and perseverance. Similarly, to give one more example sort of from that civic realm, for any of you who have read the book by Doris Kearns Goodman, Team of Rivals, in the long description of Abraham Lincoln's early rise to prominence, there's a really interesting short glimpse of an exchange he had with a young law student in 1855, and the young law student said, as Lincoln was now rising to prominence, you've lived such a compelling life already, what do I need to do to succeed? And Lincoln proceeded to say some things that certainly would make sense given his journey from a log cabin to being a successful lawyer. Treat the world as your classroom and learn whatever you can. But the quote that jumped out at me was this one: your own resolution to succeed is more important than any one thing. It's not to say that it's more important than all the other things combined, because we know that opportunity to learn can be determinative in a kid's access to high-quality curriculum, or opportunity to high-quality out-of-school time programs can also have a huge influence. And if kids don't have those opportunities, it can matter quite a lot. But that if you had to identify that one thing that is almost the secret sauce or the artificial ingredient like fluoride in toothpaste, the resolution to succeed, what you might call the fire in the belly, and what we've subsumed as perseverance, we think is really, really critical. Now, we know that some kids, and if you are in your family or your youth program or your school, some kids just walk in the door with this, and they seem to have a fire in the belly for either the subject you're teaching or the team you're coaching or just life in general. And frankly, those kids are ones who, in some ways, your task is just to, not just to get out of their way, but to nurture a disposition that is already pretty deeply ingrained. We know, however, and they do that because that was the point with the T-shirt that said, "I love math." They do that because they have intrinsic motivation in the area in which they are highly motivated and persevering. They have deep sense of joy and interest, and in fact that thing may be what at Search Institute we would call their spark. There's other kids for whom they just come with batteries included, and it may not be because they particularly enjoy a task, but they simply embrace tasks or goals as they either set them for themselves or they're set for them. And these are people who really would have a highly developed sense of what we might call internalized regulation. And they simply have kind of a mission-defined, mission-accomplished approach to life. But we know across the contexts in which you are working with and raising kids, there are many, many other young people for whom either the initial motivation to undertake a challenging task or accomplish a challenging goal, or the ability to persevere to complete that task or goal once it's begun is a struggle. And pushing that boulder up the hill is an endeavor in which they ultimately have relatively little success, with some ensuing sort of defeatist attitudes that can kick in pretty destructively. Pulled that quote there about high school dropouts, where we see almost 70% of kids who dropped out said part of the issue was that school didn't motivate or inspire them. So the big question becomes for us at Search Institute, and I think for many of you, not does this stuff matter, and not do some kids exhibit relatively high degrees of perseverance, at least in certain contexts, while others don't, but can you change this? Is it a malleable factor, something that we can move? Now, the research would suggest pretty conclusively that trying to strengthen motivation or grit or perseverance simply for its own sake, almost by yelling at the kid to say, try harder, in many cases, certainly if you're not enlisted in the military and therefore don't have a choice, is very unlikely to succeed. And that attempting simply to tell a kid that what really matters is not giving up, for a lot of kids is actually still going to leave them poorly positioned to persevere through difficulties that they encounter and to stay on course through distraction. But the good news is that the research in psychology and other fields is showing that actually if we break down that problem into its component parts, and if we really think about these as issues of mental processes, it begins to open the pathway to thinking constructively about solutions. And the basic idea to take from that is that kids, like all of us, have tapes that are playing in their heads. They have mindsets, they have learning behaviors, they have self-perceptions that oftentimes are in place before they ever walk into your program or your classroom. And that unless we actually, in some cases, re-engineer those mindsets or those behaviors, we're very unlikely ultimately to get the kinds of outcomes that we're seeking. If a young person, to use an example that is probably very familiar to many of you, sees their intelligence, their intellectual capacity as fundamentally limited, telling that young person to work harder and reach higher is going to always be at odds with their foundational perception of how smart I am and am not. But work that Carol Dweck and other psychologists have done is showing that if we actually flip that switch and help that young person understand that smart is not what you are, it's what you work to become, that is an important piece of the puzzle in terms of improving that young person's overall motivation and persistence. At Search Institute, we have attempted to distill that very complex and continually emerging body of research into what we've been calling the perseverance process, and it proceeds with all of those phases and is summarized in the acronym Share Sparks in Stick to It, and it begins with sharing sparks, identifying those intrinsic interests that motivate the young person. Think Forward, Act Now, helping the young person connect what they do today to the high aspirations that most young people have for the future, helping that young person understand that your capacity is not limited and that with effort you literally can increase that capacity and get smarter, ensuring that young people feel a sense of belonging in schools, in programs, and in their families, which is highly influential of both motivation and persistence. And then the tactics that help a young person move through those difficulties and distractions to accomplish goals. Thinking metacognition, helping young people think about why I'm feeling this way or why I'm doing this. Organized life is a term we use kind of an umbrella for the learning strategies that are proving to be so critical to educational success. And then finally, internalized regulation, the ability to suck it up and accomplish a task because it's going to get me to my larger goal. And then finally, really importantly, taking stock and taking pride. There are a few things that are as motivating for some young people as the authentic experience of competence. I did it. It took some effort, and it was acknowledged. So with that big picture introduction to the work that we're doing, Peter has been leading our work in saying, okay, how do we actually develop a conception of perseverance that is multidimensional, that includes more than one of those critical domains that influence young people's capacity to persevere through distraction and difficulty. And that's what we have built in the Perseverance Survey that is still under development, and that, as I said at the outset, we want to invite some of you to help us pilot this summer or this fall. So Peter, take it away.
Thanks, Kent. Yeah, we start with this simple definition, really, of perseverance as young people's ability to undertake and accomplish challenging tasks in school and in life. And so what we do as researchers is we take this very simple thing and we figure out how to make it more complicated. And that's what we're going to talk about for the remaining time, is how complicated this really is, in hopes of coming back full circle to an understanding that is itself pretty simple at heart. 25 years ago, we began looking at persistence. The slide is not moving. I'm trying to move it, and it is not moving for me.
Peter, I just successfully moved it, so why don't I just
okay.
Why don't I just do that? For those of you out there, you should know Peter's in St. Louis and I'm in Minneapolis, and so that is why we're not sitting next to each other making this easy for you. I apologize.
But I appreciate the president of Search Institute substituting as a graduate assistant, so thank you very much. And
I'm happy to do it.
Moving the slide.
So just say next slide.
As Kent said, we've been at this for a long time. 25 years ago, we were doing research on persistence with a single item on whether it's like me or not to give up when things get difficult. 15 years ago, we expanded that measurement into a being persistent scale, which was more items, but was still not multidimensional. It was still just focused on trying hard and not giving up. We'll go to the next slide, please. And what we found is that measures matter. You get different results when you ask youth about their persistence depending on the particular measure you use. On that single item, we found that 70% of young people said they did not give up when things get difficult. Using a 10-item scale to measure the same basic concept of persistence, only 37% acknowledged that they did. This told us a couple of things. One is that the single item was getting a very socially desirable response. In the 10-item, the more items we used, the more able we were to get variation and more young people being willing to acknowledge that they maybe didn't always keep going when things got hard. So the measures mattered. Next slide, please. As we continued over the years to look at this concept of originally persistence and now broadening to perseverance, it's been critical to incorporate the research of other scholars and other organizations that have been doing some important work. And Kent mentioned a couple of these in his comments. We've been incorporating the work of Angela Duckworth on grit and self-control, Carol Dweck on growth mindset and academic tenacity, David Connolly on time management skills, particularly in terms of how those help put kids on and keep them on a college readiness path. The University of Chicago Consortium on Chicago School Research, which has really been a tremendous influence to a lot of us on these non-cognitive factors that shape students' performance in school, and particularly their emphasis on how the context and not just the individual student influences perseverance, and the work of Castle on social emotional learning, the Strive Collaborative on collective action, collective impact, and so on, and many others. Next slide, please. What we've come to conclude is that perseverance, as Kent alluded to earlier, has both individual and ecological dimensions. There does seem to be, like many aspects of personality, a G factor aspect to perseverance. To some extent, there is something we're born with that is more stable across context. It's akin to the personality trait of conscientiousness. For those who are familiar with the research on self-efficacy, we know that self-efficacy is both a general orientation to the world of feeling confident that I can have an impact on whatever I do, and a variable sense of self-efficacy depending on the situation, the domain, the context you're in. I may feel very effective in language arts and English classes, but not nearly as efficacious in math or science, for example. So perseverance seems to have a similar combination of G factor, more innate aspects, and aspects that are domain or setting context specific that are very changeable, that are very malleable. And as the University of Chicago Consortium concluded in its review, in the bottom quote there, intelligence is embedded in both the environment and sociocultural processes. It's an interplay between cognitive and non-cognitive. It's not entirely innate, and it's not unchangeable. And so these are very important keys to not only what we identify as components of perseverance, but how we can increase perseverance in terms of the steps Kent was mentioning about our perseverance process, the Stick to It acronym. It's more than innate, and it is changeable. So on the next slide, we see that perseverance is a broad umbrella concept. It isn't just that simple definition we started with. It's a broad umbrella concept that connects multiple interrelated concepts that each kind of bidirectionally influence each other over time as young people develop. We found in our own work that there are three factors that seem to load together, that seem to overlap. If you had a Venn diagram, they're not totally distinct. They seem to load, and that intersection is perseverance. Being persistent is not giving up when things get hard. But part of perseverance is also, we're finding in our analyses, taking measured and thoughtful actions in life. And that taps into how well you set and pursue goals, planning and decision-making skills, time management skills. And then the third one is delaying gratification, that whole aspect of summarized, I guess epitomized by the marshmallow experiment. You know, are you the type of person to eat the marshmallow or defer the marshmallow? So there's pieces of all of this that overlap into our thinking about what perseverance centrally is, and that coincides with, is very similar to the conclusion that the Chicago Consortium scholars have reached about the interrelationship of non-cognitive factors such as grit, self-control, self-discipline, mindsets about academic work, mindsets about intelligence, and social skills. All of these things are connected. They're not separable when we talk about perseverance. So in the next slide, we show what our 5 key dimensions of perseverance are. As a result of our research and our scouring of others' research, the work of other scholars, we've come up with 5 dimensions that we think validly capture the sweep of what perseverance is. And they, as a group, they are 5 dimensions that are interrelated. They are both individual and ecological. They operate across family, school, community, and peer group settings. And they work as both causes and effects of each other. So, you know, from a statistical standpoint, none of this is helpful because it makes it very hard to say what's the most important of these and what should come first and what leads to what. But in a real world sense, we think that that more complex way of looking at these 5 as operating kind of holistically is a more sensible and valid way of looking at how people actually come to the point where they persevere or give up. So we'll talk a little bit about each one of these dimensions and how it's related to significant outcomes. And we'll start with the next slide on our inner drives and deepest interests. Kent mentioned that we've done a lot of work on sparks in youth, or the deep passions and interests they have that just make them want to get up in the morning, that the things that they lose track of time when they're involved with. So those kinds of deep interests and drives. Again, perseverance, we think, has a G factor where you tend to be, to some extent, a persevering individual or not. But even more so, perseverance is more likely in domains where you have already an interest or can grow an interest, in part because those intrinsic areas of interest are expressing to the world who you are. So they're identity related and not easily frustrated, not easily stopped. So there's an important point here about how we connect. Helping young people to persevere, as we saw in the earlier slides, is more than just a drill sergeant yelling in their face. Part of the trick is figuring out and helping young people figure out what their deepest interests and talents and sparks are, and then connecting those sparks to goals, and therefore helping young people make the leap of doing the hard work and sticking with it in order to use what's intrinsically interesting and motivating to them in order to reach their goals. Easier said than done, but that's a big part of the energy for promoting perseverance in young people who may have limited sense of perseverance or limited belief in their own ability to stick to difficult tasks. Part of it is also letting others know about your spark, because perseverance, as we'll see, is not just an individual action, but a social construct. Others need to know about your deepest interests and talents in order to encourage them, support them, help you, challenge you. So letting others know about your sparks is very important. And then the third bullet, desire to achieve, basic achievement motivation, and succeed. And we see in this slide that young people who are high on having sparks and letting others know about their sparks and having a drive to succeed, the orange bars, are significantly more likely to have a mastery orientation at school, which is a very important part of growth mindset, another one of our dimensions of perseverance. Very much more likely to have a sense of purpose, which has to do with the dimension of perseverance we call vision of and actions to reach future goals. They're more likely to work up to their ability very frequently, which again is part of having a vision and working toward goals, and as part of the mental toughness aspect of perseverance. And in the end, also significantly more likely to have the outcome of high grades. Not that you can't have that outcome without having a high spark. Even 51% of people with low spark have grades of B+ or higher, which maybe has to do with grade inflation as much as anything. But you're still more likely to have high grades with spark. So that's the first part of perseverance, is young people's inner drives, deepest interests, and sparks. We go on to the next slide. We look at number 2 dimension, is the vision of and action to reach goals. Young people are more likely to persevere if they have a positive vision of their future possibilities. If they have goals, they have a sense of purpose, they see their future selves that are possible for them, alternative futures in positive terms, and they take steps now in that second bullet to reach longer-term goals, which we alluded to earlier, we call as part of our perseverance process, think forward, act now. Take steps now to reach longer-term goals. And this includes managing emotions and behavior, self-regulation, taking initiative, planning and time management, the metacognition and self-evaluation skills that Kent mentioned earlier. And we see in some of our work, in a very large study in Dallas, which is an entirely urban, almost entirely poor African-American, Latino student sample, significant correlations of just time management skills in 1 year with students' GPA and PSAT scores in the next year. Okay, these are, for social science, these are pretty good correlations, by the way. Now if we add one more, we'll see cascading in on this same slide, we should see one more set of bars, and that is the literature on how effective teachers impact achievement. So effective teachers have a correlation range with achievement of 0.26 to 0.46. More often in that mid-range, low to mid-range, actually, is more common. So you can see that just time management skills, which is an aspect of perseverance that is very teachable, it's very learnable, it's malleable, correlate almost as highly, or about as highly, with next year's GPA and PSAT scores as having an effective teacher does. And all the research shows that effective teachers are, that's where the rubber meets the road and contribute the most to explaining students' achievement results. So even this one single aspect of perseverance can have quite powerful impact. Number 3 dimension is something that's gotten a lot of traction in recent years, and that's growth mindset. Young people are more likely to persevere if they believe they can get smarter, if they believe intelligence is malleable, if they believe in their own competence and they can achieve success through hard work, they believe they can reach their goals. Young people who like to be challenged, they like to learn new things and like to be stretched, that's what we're looking for. We want to promote that in young people, because that's going to give them much more probability of sticking with difficult tasks, is actually enjoying facing an interesting or difficult problem to solve, being open to challenges, and focused on improving your personal best. And this is where, you know, traditional ways of evaluating student progress kind of fly in the face of perseverance, because if you're motivated by getting high grades, more so than by improving your knowledge and the love of learning and getting better at the skill, better at that domain of expertise, whether it's a sport, or it's a musical involvement, it's giving speeches, it's math or science or English, you're not liable to persevere as much when things get tough, when you're faced with harder material. So this is something that we see in our research when we look at correlates of what are the correlates of being persistent across demographic groups. That sense of self-efficacy, that I can do this, I believe in my competence, is absolutely key for all 6 racial ethnic groups that we've studied. It's a key growth mindset component. Time and youth programs, out-of-school programs, which may be sponsored by school and may be sponsored by community organizations, but they're out of the formal school day time. Important for 4 of 6 racial ethnic groups. And this is critical because in effective youth development programs, all 5 of the dimensions of perseverance, not just growth mindset, but all 5 of them can be really strongly developed in a way that schools often have trouble developing all 5 because of the way we're structured and the way students and teachers are evaluated. It's very difficult to have the freedom to promote all 5 of these necessary dimensions of perseverance. But good youth programs help young people identify their sparks. They help them have a possible sense for their future and learn how to set goals. They help them get mentally tough. They help them have a sense of simply getting better at a skill without being graded in it. That's a very important part of growth mindset mastery orientation. And they have, as we'll see in the 5th important dimension, opportunities for support and challenge provided to young people through these positive developmental relationships. So huge important opportunity for young people is time and youth programs. The 4th component is mental toughness. And this is the ability of a young person to feel that he or she can overcome diversity, to be determined, to really, once you get involved in something, to stick to it, to stay emotionally positive and optimistic despite setbacks and disappointments, and to accept mistakes as an inevitable and necessary part of growing and learning. Mistakes are useful, so always wanting to learn even when you know something more. In the sidebar there in the blue, we see in some of our research very significant differences in grades by aspects of mental toughness, by positive emotions, resourcefulness, for example, how able young people are to adapt and adjust and create a plan B and a plan C when they need to, when they're frustrated or not succeeding. And that is something that, again, out-of-school programs have an excellent opportunity to do. We can do it in schools. It's not as common, but these are some of the things that when we can promote them, we see tremendous differences in ultimate goals that we're interested in, such as academic achievement. On number 5, the next slide, this is where we see the full circle, that perseverance is, yes, it's ultimately an individual act. One has to decide to persevere or not, or to give up. But it's ultimately everything about these dimensions, other 4 dimensions of perseverance, is nurturable in what we call developmental relationships, relationships young people have with adults and peers that provide them, with care, with support, with challenges, opportunities to expand their possibilities, and opportunities to share power in that relationship. In many ways, this 5th dimension of perseverance, the relational dimension, is possibly even more important for some cultural groups, and we'll see that as our research unfolds, because there may be a sense that so much of what we're talking about in perseverance is individually oriented, and a number of of racial, ethnic, religious, cultural groups are more collectively motivated. And it's not, I achieve things not simply for my own sense of self-esteem or accomplishment, but I achieve them to make my family proud, to help my family, to help my community, to help my race in a grander sense of purpose. So this is through the relationships and the collective kind of influence that young people have in their families, experience in their families, schools, communities, peer group. This is a tremendously important part of the support for perseverance. You can see in this slide that when young people experience these elements of developmental relationships, caring, and voice and expectations, which reflect challenge, expanded possibilities, and sharing of power, they're far more likely to feel connected, belonging to school, and far more likely to feel that they're academically, effective, have a high degree of academic confidence. And in fact, the academic confidence, efficacy, is very closely related to performance in school, and experiencing that caring and support over there on the far left, that purple bar for high efficacy, young people with high levels of caring are more likely to have high academic efficacy even than young people who experience high expectations. So all of these things together, these 5 dimensions, are very important aspects of perseverance. In the next slide, we just summarize that all this is really a description of a broad framework for understanding, studying, and promoting perseverance that at the end of the first quote suggests that rather than trying to change young people's innate tendency to persevere, the G factor part, the larger segment of perseverance is that self-perception, domain and setting specific, context specific aspect of perseverance that we can change. And in the second quote, trying to change the individual in isolation from context might not be very effective in the long run. And that includes not in isolation from the social relationships that are the way, the powerful way that young people's other 4 aspects of perseverance gets nurtured. Very quickly in the next couple of slides, we want to show what happens, what do our data say about how these multiple dimensions and multiple settings might act as correlates and predictors of perseverance and school success outcomes, because there are implications throughout here for how we build perseverance that Kent talked about in describing the perseverance process. When we look at a 360-degree view of students' total ecology, which is the 40 developmental assets that we alluded to at the beginning, this includes support and challenge and so forth in developmental relationships, but also assets such as social competencies and commitment to learning, positive values like responsibility, and aspects of positive identity such as self-efficacy that are part of our conception, broad conception of perseverance. And you can see very clearly that as the number of assets young people report experiencing goes up, so does their reporting that they do not give up when things get difficult. Second specific, next slide, shows another example of specific personal and ecological assets being related to persistence. This shows the mean score on being persistent, again, not giving up when things get hard, by the levels of empowerment young people experience, by the levels of the developmental relationships they have, and by whether or not they have long-term goals. The long-term goals include goal to graduate from college, to own their own home, to not become a parent until after they're married. Empowerment we measured by at least once a month parents ask for their opinions. At least a few weeks in the previous year, they had an opportunity for some formal community service or volunteering. And developmental relationships we measured by things such as they're saying they often receive respect and help from non-family adults, and conversations from non-family adults that last more than 5 minutes. So we had very specific definitions for these things. And you can see there were a total of 12 assets that measured these three aspects: empowerment, relationships, goals. And the more assets of this type that young people had, the more likely they were, in the purple over at the left, to not give up when things get hard. The next slide shows, again, the same thing. Using slightly different, we still look at the impact of relationships, but this time we look at what's the degree to which young people have these outcomes if they have identified their sparks, their inner drives and deepest interests, the #1 dimension of perseverance, if they have the positive relationships, the #5 dimension, and if they have voice, which covers a number of aspects of dimensions 2, 3, and 4 in the perseverance framework. And again, you can see as we move from young people who have criterion levels of none of those 3 strengths, sparks, relationship, and voice, from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the screen, the more likely they have this outcome is highly correlated with how many of the strengths they meet criterion levels for having. Working up to their ability in school, sense of purpose and hope, a high GPA, a feeling that community involvement on their part is important. So this is not just about, these strengths help young people be selfishly successful, but rather that they have an increased commitment to contribute and be a social asset to others, and mastery goals in school. So one outcome after another. It's always the same. These dimensions of perseverance are related to the kinds of positive outcomes we want for young people. In our next slide, we see one of our latest pieces of data comes from a large grant that Search Institute got from the Department of Education, Investing in Innovation competition, in a program that's called Building Assets, Reducing Risk, that is built on promoting the 40 developmental assets and focusing on the growth mindset, the ability, beliefs about ability level and changeability of skill and intelligence that affects students' ideas about what they can achieve and how hard an investment they should make in work, because after all, one way to save face for yourself and save self-esteem is if you think you can't do something, tell yourself you're not interested in it and it doesn't matter, and so therefore your success in it, is unimportant. So students have to make a decision to work hard, and that's often affected by their beliefs about the payoff from hard work, and a lot of that is affected by whether they have these positive, sustained developmental relationships in school. And the Building Assets, Reducing Risk program tries to build those sustained relationships and change those mindsets about achievement, ability, and possibility. And what we see is after just one semester of BAR implementation in a rural school using a random controlled trial, treatment, BAR students and control, there was a 10% difference in students who passed all courses, 9th grade students, that critical 9th grade year. 10% doesn't sound like much, but in stat world, that's an effect size of 0.36, And the U.S. Department of Education sets an effect size of 0.25 as the level that defines something of substantial importance. So without knowing anything else about what these statistics mean, 0.36 is a lot bigger than 0.25. So that's substantially important. Now, we have to, this is a preliminary result. We have to see what future data collection says about it, whether it backs it up, but awfully promising that these kinds of focused attempts to provide the sustained relational support for perseverance and specific activities to change growth mindset, to increase mental toughness, to help students have a more positive vision about their future, number 2 dimension, have real payoff. And finally, we look at the next slide, and we see that the odds ratio of having a high GPA in high school, given that you have perseverance dimensions in middle school, this is not just about school. A lot of our research shows that the kinds of impacts and outcomes we want in school for young people are affected by substantially by what they experience outside of school, not only in school. If you look here, you can see that young people who have community connections, the blue bar in the middle, that represents the ecological aspects of perseverance that we've been talking about, the socio-cultural influence on perseverance. That number over on the right, 3.13, that means they're more than 3 times as likely to have a B+ or higher average in high school than students who don't have these kinds of community connections in middle school. Similarly, the bottom line, the responsibility, the green line, that represents the individual dimensions of perseverance that we've been talking about. And students who have those kinds of norms of responsibility, who value school success, who have that sense that they can adapt and adjust, they're twice as likely in high school to have high GPA if they have those individual aspects of perseverance in middle school. And so in the final slide, we just come back full circle to the dimensions of perseverance. And note again that we're measuring all 5 of these dimensions. We're finishing our survey and pilot testing it in the rest of this year, and looking for partners, as Kent mentioned, in that endeavor, and launching the perseverance process workshops and resources so that we'll have an entire package and program of survey and supports available by the beginning of next year, because we think we can not only study and understand perseverance, but promote it in practical, doable ways through this work that we're doing. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kent for a brief sum up, and thank you all for your participation today.
Thank you so much, Peter. You can see on the screen there that there are 2 colleagues, Justin and Mary, here at Search Institute, that we would invite you to contact if you're interested in working with us on one of 2 things. The Perseverance Survey, which we're looking for organizations that work with young people to help us pilot this summer or this fall. Age range is really middle and high school kids. It could include some upper elementary. We're also going to be in August, and there's more information on our website. I'm going to be conducting a series of day-long workshops that are going to walk participants through what hopefully will be a fun and engaging set of activities that ground them in the components of that stick-to-it process that we talked about at the beginning. Let me just give you a quick example of that. This is really about trying to find practical ways to put research in the hands of people who work directly with kids. So there's been a large number of psychological experiments that basically find really interesting positive effects from having young people hear from older young people who are like them, who they can relate to, about how they persevered. and some really extraordinary outcomes from very brief interventions along these lines. So one of the things we'll be talking about at the Perseverance workshops in August is in your out-of-school time program or on your team or in your school, especially as young people are right at one of those critical life transitions, either preparing to or recently having transitioned, for instance, from elementary to middle school or middle to high school, or on the cusp of some other important developmental shift. Bringing older peers who they can relate to into a conversation with them that you have to structure and you have to prep for, but the basic point of which is people like you struggle during this transition that you're going through are going to go through, but if you stick to it and if you do these things, such as, for instance, seeking help when you need it, I got through it and you'll get through it. Very, very simple kind of intervention that I think, as a former high school teacher, I wish we'd done with every ninth grader that came into the large high school that I taught in, because had we brought in some juniors and seniors who essentially said, when I got here, I felt like this, this, and this, but then these things happened to me, and I found my way, and I stayed on track, or I got on track. Something that we know happens organically for some kids, but that if we're serious about strengthening perseverance with all kids, we probably actually need to do in a fairly structured way. So those workshops will be opportunities. They're frankly, just to be really clear, not for somebody who has read every book on mindset and read every paper of Angela Duckworth's, but are intended to help educators and out-of-school time folks really get on the ground floor of understanding this kind of information. Coming to the workshops doesn't require working with us on the pilot survey, but we're hoping that some organizations will choose to do both. There's no cost for participating in the pilot survey. There's a modest cost for the workshops we're holding initially in Minnesota. We also do workshops like that around the country. I am headed to California next week to do some for an organization in the San Francisco area, and so that's another option for working with us as well. So we are at a little bit past time. I want to thank all of you. I apologize we didn't have time for questions, but our email addresses are also on the screen, and please don't hesitate to be in touch with us, either Peter or myself or other colleagues here at Search Institute. I'll turn it back over to Sam, and thank you again very much